And good morning and welcome to this BBC News special programme where we are bringing you continuing coverage of an extremely poignant day. The hearse bearing the Queen's coffin is due to leave Balmoral within the next few moments. It will be making the journey to the Palace of Holyrood House in Edinburgh. With my guests, I'll be guiding you throughout the day as we expect thousands of people to come out along many parts of this long route to pay their respects. A journey expected to take, we are told, about 6 hours, ending ultimately in Edinburgh. We start, though, of course, this morning in Balmoral. My colleague Anita McVeigh has been there for many days and joins me from there now. And we all wait together, Anita. We all wait to find out what our own individual emotions will be at that moment, at the moment we see the coffin driven out of the gates of Balmoral, a place that the Queen loved so much.
Jane, I think that's absolutely right. We are anticipating that moment when we see the Queen's coffin for the first time. You know, a lot of people have said to me over the last few days, it doesn't seem real. They, after all, saw that photograph of the Queen just 5 days ago meeting the new Prime Minister. But this moment, when the coffin emerges, well, that will be something that is tangible. Let me give you a little sense of what is happening and has been happening over the last few minutes at the castle itself. We know that 6 gamekeepers, gillies as they're known, from the Balmoral estate will carry the coffin from the ballroom where it has been resting through the small dining room out to the hearse, and the Queen will be played out of Balmoral for the final time by her piper, the Queen's piper, the Sovereign's piper, to give him his official title, to the tunes Balmoral and Glengelder. And these are the moments when, of course, the royal family, the members of the royal family who have been here since Thursday, also her close personal staff, many of whom have served her for decades, will be spending those last private moments with the Queen, saying those goodbyes, those final goodbyes here at Balmoral, the place that she loved so much and spent so much happy time in. We understand that the oak coffin will be draped with the royal standard for Scotland, and we've been getting a little bit of detail about the wreath, the simple wreath that will be placed on the coffin. We're told that that wreath will be made up of phlox, dahlias, sweet pea, limonium, white heather, as well as pine and fir, all cut here from the gardens and the estate. And I think there will be a simplicity to this part of the journey, in contrast to the solemn grandeur that we no doubt will see for the state funeral. But there will be a simplicity to this which I think is very much reflective of what the royals and the Queen loved about this place, because here their life was much simpler. It was a life, a normal life compared to perhaps their other residences. And I spoke to the minister at Glenmick Church in Ballater, which is the nearest town to Balmoral Castle and which has a close association with the royal family. I spoke to him yesterday and he told me that metaphorically, when the Queen arrived here, she hung her crown on the castle gates. He said this was a place where she could be a wife, a mother, and later a grandmother and great-grandmother. It was a place where she could feel relaxed, breathe, be with family and friends, with her dogs, and really relax. It was really wonderful to have that conversation with the minister, because he has met the Queen on a number of occasions, spoken to her at length. Let me tell you about one of the anecdotes that he shared with me. He was talking about the floods in Ballater, which caused huge destruction to part of the town in 2015, and later, after repairs had been made, the Queen paid a visit to thank volunteers. One of the people that she spoke to was a gentleman 1 year younger than the Queen, he had always taken care of the war memorial in front of the church in Ballater. And although he was elderly after the floods, he painstakingly restored the war memorial to its pristine condition. And when the Queen was meeting him, she said, "You do remember me, don't you?" And it turned out that he was the son of someone who worked here on the estate, and that the Queen and he had played together as children. And he said, "Yes, Mum, of course I remember you, but I didn't want to presume." And then I was told about this wonderful conversation they had, the two of them, where they reminisced about playing hide and seek together, playing poo sticks together. And it was clear, the Reverend told me, that the Queen had such fond and happy memories of her childhood here. Of course, she spent part of her honeymoon at Balmoral as well, and all those summer holidays where she could really relax. I was also reflecting with him that this moment, Jane, as you alluded to, when we see the coffin, it will be an incredibly emotional time for people for many, many reasons. There is, of course, that grief for the Queen, perhaps bringing to the surface feelings of grief for people that we have lost. And also, I think it will be about the change that her death represents, because she has been a constant for so long, for 70 years of her reign. She's been described by people here to me as steadfast, as a rock, as a beacon of hope, that politicians have come and gone, but that she has been a constant. And she has been a constant through turbulent times, turbulence which we still live through, the pandemic, the financial crisis, the war that's going on in Ukraine. But the Queen has always been the constant through all of those times, but now she is gone. And it's no coincidence, is it, that King Charles III, in his address to the nation, he mirrored some of the language that the Queen also used when she was crowned. We see that the police officers who've been standing guard at the gates have moved. We've, just before you came to us, seen police motorcycle outriders and other vehicles moving past this position down to the Balmoral bridge that leads out to the main road and to Crathy Kirk, the church where the royals worship when they are here over the summer holidays. So we take this as a signal that the hearse carrying the Queen's coffin is close by. We understand that we will also see the Princess Royal, Princess Anne, and her husband, Vice Admiral Tim Lawrence, accompanying the coffin on its journey. We understand that the other members of the royal family who are here, we saw them looking at the floral tributes yesterday and thanking people who had come to pay their respects. We understand they will stay here at the castle for the moment, but will at some point after that follow on to Edinburgh, which is of course the destination for the cortège today. And once the hearse has left the castle, it will make its way through the Aberdeenshire countryside, including to Ballater, that town I mentioned, where people said they felt so protective of the Queen. They of course still feel protective of her. They say they feel protective of the royal family at all times, but especially in these days. It will make its way through Ballater and then onto the outskirts of towns, including Aberdeen, Dundee, and then on to Edinburgh, the Royal Mile, and to the Palace of Holyrood House. This will take them past, just a short distance from where I'm standing, Crathy Kirk, the church where the Queen and other royals worshipped during their summer holidays. In fact, just about a week ago, the Queen was speaking to the Right Reverend Dr. Ian Greenshields, the moderator of the General Assembly of Scotland, here at Balmoral. He said that she was obviously frail, but absolutely on the ball and very much engaged with what was going on in the church. And that was what we saw reflected, of course, just on Tuesday, just 5 days ago, when she had those audiences with the outgoing Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, and then invited the new Prime Minister, Liz Truss, to form a government. And I can just see now in the background the hearse and other vehicles almost at the gates of Balmoral. She came here at the start of the summer holidays, but leaves now for the final time. So that was, well, it's difficult to sum up, isn't it, really, seeing the Queen's coffin for the first time. I began by saying that so many people had said to me that this didn't seem quite real, and I know that people in local towns will be lining up to pay their respects. As we came here this morning, we saw cars parked in lanes, trying to catch a glimpse, trying to find a position to catch a glimpse of the Queen's coffin, because this was a place which meant so much to her. And it's very clear, talking to local people in Ballater and the surrounding area, how much she meant to them. The shop windows filled with pictures and recollections of the Queen. So many people gathering in the town. Thousands and thousands of them over the last couple of days, making their way from Ballater and other surrounding towns to come here to Windsor Castle, to lay flowers, to read messages, to spend a quiet moment, yet so many of them saying it didn't seem quite real. I think seeing the coffin begin this very solemn journey certainly makes it real. And we're now showing you images of Ballater, which I've been talking about, as I say, the closest town to Balmoral Castle. The Queen has been there on a number of occasions during her reign. Other members of the royal family, perhaps even more frequently than her, but they see themselves very much as the royal family's town, the people of Ballater. And there are many people lined up there now today to wait for this coffin passing through, to catch that first glimpse of this final journey for the Queen from the place that she loved so well, a place that she was really passionate about. I heard also that the King is very passionate about. I mentioned those floods in Ballater back in 2015, 2016, and the huge damage they caused, and I was told a story about how an elderly lady was told by her insurance company that it would be weeks before anyone could come to assess her property, and she was very distressed. And the minister at the church was giving Prince Charles, then Prince Charles, now King Charles, regular updates on the situation in the town. And he then received a call from a Buckingham Palace aide saying that the Queen would also like an update. And he spoke to the Queen, and the Queen said to him, "If it will help, you can mention my name, because I don't want to see people suffering unnecessarily." And I thought that was a wonderful little anecdote to illustrate just how much she cared about this place. So we can see these shots now from our helicopter of the hearse carrying Queen Elizabeth's coffin, making its way to Ballater, and then the journey eventually to Edinburgh. Royal officials say that they want everything that happens in the next few days to reflect the dignity of the Queen's reign, and also to allow people a proper opportunity to witness history, to witness her coffin passing by their areas. And once the coffin has moved through Ballater, it will take the A93 towards Aberdeen before turning south and crossing the King George V Bridge, named of course after the Queen's father, and then on to the outskirts of Dundee, and then to the Royal Mile in Edinburgh, before reaching the Palace of Holyrood House and laying at rest there until tomorrow, Monday, when the coffin will be taken to St Giles Cathedral in Edinburgh. The coffin will remain there until Tuesday, before, accompanied by the Princess Royal, Princess Anne, it will be flown to London. So more police vehicles, other service vehicles and members of the royal household leaving now. In total, we're told there will be a large number of vehicles in this procession making its way finally to Edinburgh. Obviously a huge amount of security, but some of that following at a discreet distance from those initial vehicles, the hearse of course, and then the car carrying Princess Anne and her husband, Vice Admiral Tim Lawrence. We believe the other members of the royal family who have been here over the last few days remain at Balmoral. So we have the Earl and Countess of Wessex, Edward and Sophie, their daughter Lady Louise. We have Prince Andrew, his daughters the Princesses Beatrice and Eugenie, among those still here, and of course those close members of staff, many of whom have served the Queen for decades, hearing this morning that they are naturally deeply upset at this final parting for the Queen from the place that she loved so well. And I'll just repeat, if I may, that anecdote, that description rather, that the Reverend David Barr from the church in Ballater told me yesterday in my conversation with him, because I thought it summed up really why the Queen loved this place so much. He said metaphorically she could hang her crown on the main gates as she came in. He said she could be a mum, a wife, later a grandmother, a great-grandmother, and totally relax while she was here. Although I think it's also important to reflect that those last images we saw of the Queen just 5 days ago, Tuesday, were of her carrying out her duties. She has been praised for her sense of service, her sense of duty, Those are the sorts of phrases I've heard from people I've been talking to, people who've been coming to lay flowers and leave messages. And she was carrying out her duties right until the very end. And although logically we knew that she was frail, that there were concerns about her health, and logically we knew that this moment would be in the near future, it was nonetheless a surprise, wasn't it? Given that we had seen those photos just on Tuesday, to hear the news on Thursday of the concerns for her health, those concerns growing as members of the royal family rushed to be here. And now today, Sunday, the Queen leaving Balmoral Castle for her final journey. Jane, back to you.
Anita, very many thanks. Anita McVeigh in Balmoral. And watching these images with me here in the studio is the historian and writer Robert Lacey and the BBC's Martin Geisler, my colleague from BBC Scotland. Martin, just a thought about what we're watching and the areas that this convoy, the areas that the Queen's convoy, the Queen's coffin is going to be passing through.
Well, what we're watching is a really sad and sombre last journey. Finality is the word here, isn't there? Isn't it? We've just seen the convoy, the Queen passing through the gates of Balmoral for the last time, a place that she's known her whole life and loved probably more deeply than any other place on earth. And when Anita's talking about the links between Royal Deeside and the royal family, they do run deep. We keep hearing about it, but we keep hearing about it because it's true. I mean, Princess Anne got married to Vice Admiral Tim Lawrence in Crathy Kirk, the kirk they've just passed. Not only did the royal family worship there right back to the days of Queen Victoria, but they've been married there. Prince Charles, we're just about to, or King Charles rather, we're just about to see Ballater, and just about a mile south of Ballater is Birk Hall, the house on the Balmoral estate that was left to King Charles by the Queen Mother, where he spent many happy times. He proposed to Camilla, the Queen Consort, there. They spent their honeymoon there. So this is not a place that they just happen to go to for a few weeks a year. This is a place that they choose to go to for big moments in their life. And because that's a lovely expression, isn't it? The Queen could hang her crown on the gates of Balmoral and effectively take off her shoes and just get on with being a person rather than a monarch. And that's why. The route that we're going to see the convoy take effectively traces the route of the River Dee until Aberdeen, about 40 odd miles, till the outskirts of Aberdeen, and passes through half a dozen or more Deeside towns. We'll see Ballater shortly. It'll go through Aboyne, Kincardine, O'Neill, Banchory, until it gets to Peter Cooter and then Cults, which are effectively suburbs of Aberdeen itself. There was a more direct route that the convoy could have taken to Edinburgh. It could have gone down through Glen Shee and down through the Glens. Beautiful, spectacular scenery, great climbing territory that the royals would have known so well in the summer, and skiing country in the winter. But the problem with that route is that while it's more direct, it doesn't really pass through many conurbations. And they've chosen this route because it'll take them through cities, through Aberdeen, through Dundee. It'll trace just the outskirts of Perth, and then down through Fife, through the Kingdom of Fife, and over the Queensferry crossing, a bridge that the Queen opened 5 years ago, and then into Edinburgh itself. So it is a longer route, but it will give people a chance, as we see here, them coming in, I think, into Ballater, a chance to come out and pay their respects. And judging by these early pictures that we're seeing in the first communities that they're passing through, they're certainly coming out in good number.
And absolutely, let's talk about that, because this chosen partly, as you're reflecting, Martin, to allow people in certain areas along the route to gather. Local councils have been telling people where they can stand, explaining how they can stand and pay their respects. And you are nodding to exactly what strikes us immediately. Let's talk briefly to Rachel Bell, who is in Ballater itself. And from the vantage points that we have, Rachel, it certainly looks as if a lot of people have come out this morning. Just you can explain for us what the mood there is in Ballater, a place that knows the royal family so well, and what's happening there.
Yes, people have been lining the streets since very early this morning, putting chairs out so that they have the best spot to view the Queen's hearse as it passes by. This is, has already been said, this is a community which is 8 miles down the road from Balmoral, one which has had such close connections to the royal family. Hundreds of people lining the streets here at Ballater, ready to watch the hearse as it comes into view. Be shortly arriving in the main street of Ballater. It will travel past Ballater's old railway station, the closest station to the royal residence. The Queen used it many times when she was much younger on her journey to Balmoral before its closure in 1966. The royal family, in particular the Prince's Foundation, initiated its restoration after it was all but destroyed by fire in 2015. There's lots of people here at the moment, but it's very quiet as everyone waits. At 10 o'clock, the church that you can hopefully see rang out its bells. And since then, there's been a very sombre, respectful feel here in Ballater. Remember, this is a community which knows the Queen. For some here today, this is the opportunity for them to say goodbye to a neighbour. That's the phrase we've heard over and over again this week as we've been reporting from Royal Deeside.
And Rachel, let's just
that she was their
pause
neighbour.
a moment if we can as the coffin comes through, because I'm struck that you have noticed how very quiet it is there. Let's just pause and see that moment. And as the coffin passes through the town of Ballater, the town the royal family knows so well, the town's people who know the royal family, we notice one thing, don't we? Absolute silence. The BBC's Martin Geisler is with me, and that scene in itself, Martin, so striking.
Absolutely. Ballater was always going to turn out a number for this journey to see its farewells, because, I mean, a lot is made of this relationship between the royal family and the people of Royal Deeside, and it's fierce when you're in that part of the country. The passion and the level of protection that the people there offered the royal family. It was very much a two-way relationship, because the royals obviously appreciated that protection. The people there saw so much more than they said. And
Yes.
if you spend any time up there, I was fascinated by the level of exposure there was. I mean, whenever I'm up there, you say, well, do you really see them hanging about? And they say, yeah, we don't bat an eyelid. I mean, you know, Camilla, the Queen Consort, regularly in the toy shop, picking up toys for grandchildren, that kind of thing. And genuinely seen as people who loved the area. And if somebody loves the place that you live, then you take a pride in that and you welcome them. So there was this really genuine and strong bond between them. A lot of, every other shop in Ballater has a royal crest, a by appointment crest. I think I heard at one point some of them were bestowed by the Queen Mother and may now have lapsed, but they're not in any great rush to take them down. Take them down.
Indeed.
But this connection is absolutely strong, and it goes on right through Deeside.
And so important and so lovely to think that connection exists, because whatever one's view of the royal family, they are in a goldfish bowl. That is the one of the few places, or this area that you're describing is, as you suggest, just somewhere they can be a little more approaching some form of normality, as close as they can ever get.
Doing what they like to do, away from any prying eyes, getting up into the hills, picnicking, fishing, walking. I mean, there's a mountain, a Munro, just behind the castle at Balmoral called Loch Nagar. It's a wonderful walk. And it was so important to King Charles. He wrote a book about it, a children's book. It was a story that he'd first told to his younger brothers when they were young children, about an old man, the Old Man of Loch Nagar, it's called, about an old man who lived in the cliffs just below the peak of the mountain, and from memory, I think the book is about him being frustrated that he couldn't have a proper bath, and then eventually trying to have a bath and burning down the hillside. But it was a place that they spent so much time. They climbed, they fished, they walked the dogs, and you know, many people you bump into in Deeside will tell you they've been on the estate, and they hear a bark, and there's a corgi, and then
Yes.
there's a headscarf, and there's an interaction, but respect. They gave the royal family their space.
Yes, I mean, I know people who were in the area really a matter of months ago and experienced exactly that scene that you have just described. I'm trying to think, perhaps within the last year, let's say, and they commented and they said, and the Queen was driving herself.
Yeah, no,
and people
exactly.
comment on that.
And she did. There are the lovely stories of her picking up, you know, walkers in rainstorms on the mountaintops in her Land Rover, and there was a fantastic story that's been told many times over recent days by one of her protection officers, an American couple who were fascinated by the Queen living there, were picked up by the Queen but didn't recognise her. And they said, how long have you lived here? And she said, well, I've been coming here. I've got a little holiday house over the hill. I've been coming here 80 years. And they said, well, you must have met the Queen. And she said, well, I haven't, but he has, pointing to her protection officer. Anyway, the story goes on. But these kind of things did happen.
And we, again, as we see another beautiful, beautiful shot of this remarkable landscape, we should remember that people are watching this not just in the UK, but around the world. So there might be people seeing these images, and it's a reminder, if any of us need some, of just how beautiful this landscape is. And I appreciate that's not the only reason they love Deeside, but it is a contributing factor. It is absolutely stunning.
It's the reason I think Queen Victoria fell in love with Deeside and bought Balmoral, because it is absolutely bewitchingly beautiful. Even the river itself, the River Dee, just smooth, almost silky, oily, fast-flowing salmon river that gives you fantastic fishing, but just looks with the trees on the banks, the way it's laid out, the way it winds through that part of the world, just looks beautiful. It is a bewitching part of the country. You can't go there and not fall in love with it. And on a day like today, when we're looking at these pictures with the sun shining, probably just a little start of autumn chill in the air. That's how Scotland should be seen. It's when it looks at its best. You don't get that green without having a lot of rain, but on days like today, it really is majestic.
I think it's very interesting that of the last 4 monarchs to die in modern times, only one of them died in London. This love of the British countryside is a tradition in the royal family. The Queen, in fact, is the first monarch in modern times to die in Scotland. But her father and grandfather died in Sandringham. And Queen Victoria died actually on the Isle of Wight, where she loved spending so much time. And what's interesting, back in those days, they hadn't really thought out the idea that the people would want to take part in what had happened. Coffin was put on a warship that was brought to Southampton. Then it was whisked up by train to Waterloo and across London to Paddington to go on to Windsor. So it was only between those 2 London railway stations that people got a chance to pay their respects. Of course, they'll come later. There came later the lying in state and the funeral. But what we're watching here is a modern ritual, a folk ritual too, which has developed out of what you're talking about, people's sorrow, but also love and respect for the Queen. And somebody said, I heard them say they wanted to be a witness to history. I think people want to be part of history. That's the sensation.
Yes.
Grandparents bringing their children before school so that they will remember this. It will be part of their lives.
Yes. And certainly a lot of the people I spoke to at Buckingham Palace on Friday, there was a lot of that. You saw whole generations of families, didn't you? Because they wanted the children and the grandchildren to remember this turn in history, an extraordinary moment for the whole nation, for the Commonwealth, after such longevity on the throne. And Robert Lacey, those are some of the things that you and I will have time to talk about over the course of the day, while we are still very much following the Queen's coffin at the start of its final journey. That in itself is something quite hard for all of us to say and think about, isn't it? I do also want to bring in from Hamilton Professor Sir Tom Devine, who has written extensively, many books about Scottish history, right from the 16th to the 20th century. Sir Tom, thank you for being with us here on the BBC as well this morning. And as someone with unrivaled knowledge of Scottish history, I'm interested, first of all, what is going through your mind as we watch the Queen's coffin on its final journey?
I want to say, first of all, how honoured I am to be able to speak to you on this both sombre but also historic day, and your viewers, of course, as well, around the globe. My feelings are twofold. First of all, like most people, deep sadness, the poignant views of the final departure from the home she loved most. But at the same time, a recognition and a sense of pride, I think shared by a number of people, that the job she did and promised to do in her coronation oaths in 1953 has been done and accomplished in a truly unsurpassed way. So there's a kind of duality in my feelings. A job well done, the end of a wonderful life of service, but at the same time, especially seeing that vision of the departure of the hearse, which I presume is covered in the Royal Standard of Scotland. Slight sense of if not more than a slight sense of personal emotion.
And sad and poignant as today is, would you say it's fair to say that there is something fitting, beautiful almost, about the fact that Her Majesty spent her last days and weeks in the place she loved so much?
Of course, but I think there's a wider aspect to this. There's been a focus on Balmoral rightly since the beginning of your programme. But remember, the Queen and her late husband had a remarkable affection for the Scottish nation, and that as a whole. As she put it the last time she addressed the Scottish Parliament in Edinburgh, she referred to this wonderful country, namely Scotia, namely Scotland, which she and her husband loved so well with deep affection. And given, of course, the lineage of Elizabeth II, going right back in blood to the medieval days of King Robert the Bruce, who was Scotland's patriot king, ironically enough, resisting the English invasion and takeover of Scotland and preserving Scottish identity and independence during the Wars of Independence. That is one of the many reasons why she had such a love of my country.
And yes, we remember perhaps her saying that to the Scottish Parliament, and people will remember that at the time. As you are only with us for a relatively short time this morning as well, though, I do want to ask for your personal experience of that, because of course she, am I right in saying you received your knighthood from her, and that was for services to Scottish history. I wonder how much of your perhaps brief conversation that you would have had with her then, how much of that you feel able to share with us?
Yeah, well, that was, looking back now, that was a very poignant moment. She dubbed me as a Knight of the Realm with the sword of her father, King George VI, on one shoulder and then the other. And then I stood up, she shook hands and she had a few words with me. And she said, and I've never revealed this until her death, she said that it gave her great pleasure to give this honour to an historian and a scholar for his services, and she raised her voice and with great emphasis said, for services to the history of Scotland.
Yes, it's beautiful and very striking that she raised her voice as you're describing. I'm interested whether you feel that passion, that love will continue with the next generation, with King Charles and beyond.
I've absolutely no doubt about it. And certainly I know from his communications with me in the past that Charles has not only read books on the history of Scotland, but has also read some of my own. I remember when his father was presented with a new edition of one of my books, and with his great sense of humour, he put his hands in his head and said, "Oh my God, not this again." Okay, there's only 2 additional chapters. Thank God for that. As already been said in your programme, the former Prince of Wales has long had a connection to the area that we've been talking about this morning in Scotland. And I've absolutely no doubt that the strong connection between Royal Deeside and, most importantly of all, the Scottish nation as a whole will be maintained by him, almost, if you like to put it this way, instinctively. It's simply part of his mindset because of the way he's been brought up and the interest he's long had in Scotland, and indeed in Scotland's history and contribution to Great Britain. And I've also often thought over the last few years how the deep respect that the royal family have for Scotland, unfortunately, has been somewhat different from that of recent governments in the UK. And I think that's one of the reasons why in these sad days, the Scottish people, the citizens of Scotland, are going to great lengths to mark the passing of the Queen, she never had any doubt that Scotland was and is an historic nation and is part of Great Britain.
And is part of Great Britain, which reminds us inevitably of the very, very few brief words that the Queen, she alluded to the Scottish independence referendum of a few years ago. Was that absolutely a deliberate statement in your mind?
I think it's been blown up to some extent, although the very fact that she, to my knowledge, mentioned something of significant historical and important political importance, I think must have been planned, because she would know that information, those words, although in a sense you could say they were neutral words, it would go out into the public domain very, very quickly. I do think that if the independence referendum had gone to yes, despite the fact that the Scottish National Party intends to retain the monarchy if independence ever occurs, I still think she would have felt a deep wrench at the terrible loosening of the bonds with one of the four nations of the United Kingdom.
Yes, very, very interesting to hear your perspective on that. Martin, you had a thought on that?
Well, yeah, there's an argument both ways for what the Queen said. She said it was when she was going into Crathie-Kirk, just on the eve of the referendum, and she said, I hope the people of Scotland think very carefully about their future. There was a story, I think it was the editor of the Financial Times, had suggested that he'd been briefed in a lunch with Prince Andrew a few days before that something might be said. So there was a suggestion there was some choreography about this. But it's also been argued both ways by the royal household at the time that actually, if you analyse that statement, there's nothing in it. It doesn't fall on either side of the divide. Think very carefully about your future. It's simply guidance that this is a big decision you're about to make. Don't do it without giving it proper forethought. But, you know, inevitably, it was read into.
Robert,
the Queen was a master at putting meaning into words, and then you look at the words afterwards and you wonder where the meaning was. I mean, that was the essence of her skill as a constitutional monarch. But I do think it's significant that with this extraordinarily discreet sovereign who took the point of neutrality so seriously, just about the only stories we've got about her straying from total discretion involve Scotland and her affection to Scotland, and of course, as well as her remark before the referendum, David Cameron indiscreetly let slip that when he told her what the result was, she purred with happiness. The result, of course, being to stay as part of the United Kingdom, although in a devolved United Kingdom. We'll get onto this sort of thing later, but one of her geniuses, I mean, it's the same as the Commonwealth. Her personality was able to let nations go or let nations separate, but keep a sense of togetherness. And I think that's what was the essence of her attitude towards this tricky issue of Scottish independence and devolution.
In terms of the journey we are following today, of course, the ultimate destination later this afternoon is Edinburgh. That is some hours away for obvious reasons at points. This is moving very, very slowly, as we expected, as we anticipated. We were told that in some areas they wanted the vehicles to move at walking pace because, again, Martin, there are areas where we expect large crowds.
Yes, I mean, it's difficult to know what to expect. I think this is Aboyne, the town of Aboyne that we're looking at here, population just under, 3,000, something like that, like many of the Deeside towns. And there are people lining the streets, but it is quite sparse. Many of those people will have gone to Ballater, I suppose. I mean, so here's an idea of what's happening on Deeside. It's difficult to get to Balmoral and park if the car park's closed and so on. So there are buses laid on from Braemar about 4 miles away on one side, and from Ballater about the same distance away on the other side. One bus from each town. 3,000 people took them yesterday just to lay flowers at the gates. My colleague James Cook, who covers Scotland for the BBC, the Scotland editor of the BBC, said at one point in Ballater he counted 800 people in the queue for the bus. So there will be tourists among those people, of course. It's the summer at Scotland, and this is a real tourist draw. But there's an idea of the strength of feeling. And if you look now, there we go into a Boyne. There are 3 or 4 deep. I'm seeing on the south side of the road. And again, when you look at these pictures, bear in mind population 2,900. There aren't many people there watching this on the television. They're all out of their houses and come down to pay their respects. There are other parts of the route in Aberdeen. There will be an opportunity for people to come out, and I think we'll see crowds there as well as in Dundee. But most of the route will be passing through Scottish countryside. It's a practical exercise, this, to move the Queen from Balmoral to the Palace of Holyrood House, and much of it will be done just through the fields and hills of the east coast of Scotland.
Yes.
Every place in the car park there is full.
Yeah. And we saw that along the route as well. Cars parked in fields, cars parked in junctions. So yeah, you're right.
So that that's the modern token of the people who've come from a long way away, as we agree, and are there at the side of the road. And we saw them there, weren't they? In the middle of the town, they were more concentrated. Now we're leaving the town, and they're more spread out.
Yes. And again, for the benefit of international viewers, perhaps worth reminding people that the population of the whole of Scotland is...
It's 5.5 million.
Yes, less
just
than
under.
the capital, smaller than London in terms of population
almost
by
half the size.
A considerable way.
Yeah.
So, yes, you make an absolutely important point.
A third of the landmass of Britain with about 8% of the population.
And at the time of the Queen's death, I mean, we've seen the members of the royal family coming up from London, but at the time of her death, the Queen was there, and Prince Charles was there as well, not because he was expecting his mother to die, but because the monarch and the heir both love the time they spend in Scotland. We haven't had much chance to talk about Dumfries House, which is where Prince Charles loves being, and which isn't just a residence he uses. He's made that the centre of a project of rebuilding the local community, trying to generate employment, activities for young people, all these sort of things, which interestingly are the sort of things the royal family didn't do before the Queen's reign. There was the anxiety about getting involved too much in politics, but it was really the Duke of Edinburgh, with his Duke of Edinburgh's award, who showed how a member of the royal family could really, in a determined way, get involved in changing society, but without offending the politics of it.
Oh, so that's interesting. So it was started by this, this reign that has now come to an end. It was started under the late Queen and the late Duke of Edinburgh. Late
Duke of Edinburgh, and this sword being very enthusiastically taken up by Prince Charles, who we know pondered. He knew ahead of time he was going to have to wait so long, and he wanted to make his time as heir really useful. And there, he turned to his father's example of picking out causes that could make the world a better place. He was never ashamed of saying it. Like in his case, with Prince Charles, in came the idea of ecology and the countryside, and converting the royal family's natural affinity and love for the countryside into actually a political cause, which all parties espouse. These are big developments in the reign of the Queen, over which she's presided, and now we've got the new Prince of Wales, William, with his Earthshot Prize, following on from now his father and his grandfather, all under the auspices of the Queen.
That is the voice of Robert Lacey, the royal historian and biographer, who is with us throughout the day here on BBC News. As we follow the coffin bearing the Queen, ultimately on its way to Edinburgh, that is where she will rest later today. And the BBC's Martin Geisler is with us as well, my colleague from BBC Scotland. Do you have a sense, Martin, of the next town where this might be passing through? It's quite hard for us from this vantage point, isn't it? Just to keep a firm eye on exactly where we are now. This is, we should remind, this is a 175-mile journey that is being made today. So.
Exactly. I have to confess, this is not a part of the country that I come from, and I'm terrified of offending people by getting their town wrong from a bird's eye view. But if that was a Boyne, we should be approaching Banchory relatively shortly. We're about 20 miles or so from Aberdeen. To go back to, you were asking earlier on about, you were asking Professor Sir Tom Devine about the fact that, you know, this life was at some point going to come to an end, and it was appropriate that it did so in Balmoral. I was speaking to, Anita was talking earlier on about the Right Reverend Ian Greenshields, the moderator of the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland, which is a long-winded way of saying the head of the Church of Scotland, effectively. And he was with the Queen last weekend at Balmoral. He spent the weekend there. I spoke to him on Friday, and he said that he was struck by how sparky. She was frail, but she was sparky. She was on great form, he said. And he said he walked with her to a window in Balmoral, and they looked out over the garden together, and she was just speaking with great pride about the garden that had been grown there and what she was doing with it, and then talking about her memories, her horses, the time that she'd spent there. And he was shocked when he heard the news later in the week that her health had suffered and then ultimately she had passed away. But he said her love for that place was just so evident in the conversation, the long conversation that he had with her there. And he said her family will have taken, I think, great comfort from the fact that that's where her life came to an end.
And he is not alone, is he, in mentioning how, well, sparky, to use your words, that the Queen was right up until the end. Later on in the day, we hope to be talking a little more about her love of horses, her expertise in horses, hugely knowledgeable, wasn't she? And we know that on Tuesday, the day she welcomed in the new Prime Minister, that day she was talking to one of her racehorse trainers who talked about, she knew everything about the forthcoming race, knew who the favourites were.
And it wasn't just racehorses. Highland ponies are a special breed, small shaggy ponies that are used, they're hard souls, and they're used to take the deer off the hills after a hunt, the stags down from the hills. They strap the stags to the back of these ponies, and sometimes the same size, bigger than the pony, and they take them down. And the Queen bred these. She had quite a successful stud, a breeding programme for these ponies, a kind of breed apart. So yeah.
She found it rather difficult to ride them, I believe. I've seen some letters that she wrote to one of her trainers, and they were so fat, she found them rather difficult to sit on. I think just about one of her last photographs was her standing with two of these Highland Fell ponies, wasn't it? And the thing about horses, we'll be talking, as you say, more about that later, but riding gave her such a sense of freedom. No disrespect to her job, but it was freedom. That's what I think Balmoral meant to her. That's what the Royal Yacht Britannia meant to her as well.
Yes, freedom absolutely is the word, isn't it? And we will return to that, because that's the essence of the family's time in Scotland. I believe the shot we were just showing there was Banchory, I'm told.
Right. And
we just wait for a different camera angle, and again to get a sense of the number of people who are there again, lining the route, waiting to pay their respects. It's
the biggest town in Deeside. It's about 7,000 people live in Banchory. It's a kind of commuter town now to Aberdeen, but it calls itself the gateway to Royal Deeside. So there will be one would imagine, a significant turnout there as well. Crathes Castle, just on the outskirts of Banchory. The Queen would have known that. An interesting fact about Crathes Castle is that it's where Queen Victoria once reported she'd seen a ghost when she was staying the night there.
Yes, it was with Queen Victoria, as we've already remarked, that the particular modern links between the royal family and Scotland started, and as you were saying earlier, she was the one who just fell in love with what's now known as Royal Deeside, bought the Balmoral estate, later bought more land around it, and it established this link. We can see there there are more people out there, and the procession seems to be slowing. Martin, sorry, can I just ask a question?
Please do.
We heard that the standard on her coffin is the Royal Standard of Scotland.
Yes.
How is that different from the other one, or have I caught you on the hop
Thank you,
there?
Robert, for that question that I am massively unqualified to answer.
I saw a huge Scottish lion on it.
Yes, well, it was Sir Tom Devine who suggested he presumed it would be the Royal Standard of Scotland. My presumption, and I expose myself now to an incoming volley of correction from people who know these things better than me, that the Royal Standard is a different flag when the monarch is in Scotland than it is when she's south of the border. Yeah.
There's the big red lion on gold.
Heraldry is not my strong suit, I have to confess.
I fear you and I are both in the dark on that, and will doubtless be corrected if that is, if we are incorrect. So we put our apologies out there immediately. I don't know for sure, but perhaps someone can try and find out. I'm sure someone will tell us.
Yeah.
And we should perhaps explain that the local councils have been urging people, whilst encouraging people, of course, to line the route, to pay their respects. People were quite specifically urged by some of the councils not to throw flowers at the vehicles as they pass. Officials said they really wanted to discourage that, so that there weren't, on a practical level, I'm afraid, that there simply weren't problems for road users later in the day. That is what local people were told. And I mention it because inevitably we think of scenes 25 years ago, and that is an image that sticks in people's minds, isn't it, from that period of people spontaneously, perhaps something that officials, nobody really expected, people throwing flowers onto the vehicles as they passed.
There's a different sense, though, I think, today. Would you agree? I mean, 25 years ago, there was a sense of suddenness and grief. And today there seems to be a sense of sorrow. But perhaps inevitability. This was a life well lived, a long life well lived. And, while this has come as a great shock to the country, I think there will be a different sentiment when we see the convoy passing through, the cortège passing through cities. I don't think we're going to see similar scenes. I don't know, but certainly, it feels different to Diana's
Yes, and
death.
when we paused as long as we did and we watched through Ballater, I mean, there was something very beautiful and very respectful about the silence.
Yeah.
People just standing still.
Powerful.
In this world where we don't stand still often enough, we don't look up from our phones. And people were doing that, standing, simply watching with their own thoughts, not that far out from the end of a pandemic. Lots of people who followed coverage of the last few days who've lost loved ones during that pandemic. The national mourning brings home, doesn't it? It reminds individuals, families of those they have lost themselves, particularly over the events of the last couple of years. And you're right, it is a different mood and tone, perhaps. Robert?
In Ireland, where the head of state is elected every 5 or 7 years, I think, Republicans point out that the advantage of the Irish system is not just that every 5 or 7 years they can choose their head of state, as opposed to the United Kingdom where you inherit your head of state. But for those presidential elections, the country gets a time to debate the values they want represented by the head of state they're going to elect. And interestingly, Ireland was ahead of so many other countries in electing women, like Mary McAleese and so on, for the job. Well, I think we're at a moment like that in the United Kingdom. that as we discuss these issues, you've mentioned the regret at the Queen's passing, but at the same time the celebration of her life and looking forward to the new reign. It is a time for contemplation of the values that this institution and these people, Queen Elizabeth II and now King Charles III, represent and are supposed to represent. And so I think that perhaps confused feeling of reflection is natural, but also very healthy. And people have already called for this being a time, well, Prince Charles himself has talked about this being a time for reflection about what we stand for and the values that our head of state does represent and should represent.
You're watching BBC News as we bring you continuing coverage. We're following the coffin of the Queen on a 175-mile journey today. It will arrive in Edinburgh much later this afternoon. And within the last hour, the Queen left Balmoral, her favourite home, for the very last time. And this was the moment in the quiet of Balmoral this morning that the Queen began her final journey. "175 miles, which we are told today will take in the region of 6 hours, but that simply depends on the number of crowds that turn out. Many towns have made provision for people to line the route, and we've certainly seen that through Ballater. I can hear people talking. And the cortège now on the route to Banchory, expected there perhaps within the next 10 minutes is what we're told.
That car behind is the royal limousine. It's got blanked windows. You said that was Princess Anne and Commander Tim Lawrence. Is that correct?
Forgive me, I don't know. My understanding, I thought, was that other members of the royal family were...
They were in a second convoy, I think, that left shortly after.
Oh.
We will endeavour to find out, Robert.
Sorry.
We have certainly established that the coffin is indeed draped in the Scottish standard.
It is.
Yes.
Good, we've
So
established
everyone correct on that point.
Yes. And I think I was mistaken in my suggestion that Princess Anne is in that car behind.
According to the notes I have, there is a royal car containing the Lord Chamberlain and the Minister of Crathy Church, if that makes sense.
Yes. Well, the Lord Chamberlain, of course, is very old established royal position that goes back even before the time of 1066, representing the court, so that would make sense.
Mm. You were saying, Jane, about crowds coming out in cities and provision being made by councils to let that happen. The interesting thing is that there hasn't been much time to communicate that information. I left Scotland yesterday afternoon and I hadn't seen much in the way of direction to people as to where to go. Now, people who know the route, when they pass through Dundee, for example, there is only one way. They will get from the road, from the Aberdeen road through to the road that will take them to Perth and then to Edinburgh. So people will work that out. But I think the papers this morning have something of the route, but because this has only happened, obviously, given the circumstances of the last few days, very suddenly, there hasn't been much time for public preparation. These plans have been in place, of course, for years, but they were never publicised.
Indeed.
So a lot of it will be down to, I guess, people finding out this morning. They'll be put up online and people will know where to go, but some of it will just be spontaneous, as we see in the kind of hamlets and villages passing through here. This looks like it will be Banchory.
Yes.
Well, it was such a shock, wasn't it, for people on a Tuesday to see the Queen standing up talking to two prime ministers, and then to hear the dreadful news 2 days later. The best laid preparations were overtaken.
So the coffin makes its way to the town of Banchory as part of its 175-mile journey to Edinburgh. And again, for people perhaps just joining us, just watching these images for the first time this morning, perhaps, possibly for some, this is the moment that this becomes real, that the remarkable reign of 70 years has come to an end. The first sight of the coffin leaving the gates of Balmoral, where the Queen died on Thursday afternoon. That first moment, perhaps that just personal human recognition that we are into a new era in the UK and around the Commonwealth.
You're right about that sense of finality. We've all been to funerals of relatives or friends and we think we're doing okay in the days since they passed, and then you see the coffin and suddenly something hits you. There will be people right along this route who are experiencing that just now. It feels real.
Just that I was about to use that exact word. It's the reality, isn't it? We've all known, a lot of people will have watched a lot, seen a lot, listened to a lot in the last few days. Thousands and tens of thousands of people have been to various royal residences. They've laid flowers, they've written letters, left cards. But now the Queen makes her very last journey. And that is such a poignant moment.
Towards the capital of Scotland, and then, of course, in due course, to London, where the more familiar ceremonies will take place. I was struck yesterday down by Buckingham Palace, as you were, by how uncanny it was to see the stands going up and the scaffolding.
Yes,
and,
a lot of construction, a lot of preparation.
Yes, just a reminder of how many people there will be there taking part, and people looking. I mean, when the scaffolders went past, there were cheers because people have this sense of loss, which will be developing over the next 10 days until, what is it, Monday week, when the funeral and the bank holiday take place.
And such a turn in a matter of a few months, because you mentioned the preparations going on in many places, including Edinburgh and London. It is only 3 months since We were, well, you and I were there, Robert. You and I were there for Trooping the Colour. That
Yes.
glorious, unexpectedly hot day. Tens of thousands of people, those scenes of people streaming down the Mall.
But
The
first
optimism, the
one-
the cheers when the Queen came out onto the balcony.
But indeed, the clues there as to what was to come. The
Yes.
fact that she, I mean, when you think back to the grand days of her reign, she would ride in the Trooping the Colour. And so many of the commemorative coins of her reign show her on horseback in truly majestic pose. But then the mobility problems, we could see for ourselves the first evidence of the fact that, well, she came out on the balcony twice, didn't she? And,
She did.
But it was an indication of what was to come, and the fact that at her Platinum Jubilee service in St Paul's, it was Prince Charles, as he then was, who represented her. And I think if we look back earlier to this year to her Accession Day statement in February, where sad occasion, remembering when her father died in Sandringham, and we expected her to pay tribute to her father as she always would do on her Accession Day. But that was the occasion when she mentioned the welcome that was needed for Queen Camilla. She was herself already thinking of the future and getting ready for that.
So this is Ballater.
Banchory we're in now.
Banchory. Thank you for keeping me right. I've been through Ballater. This is Banchory, I meant to say.
But again, the crowds, many people deep.
It is a big town. It's, well, a comparatively big town for Royal Deeside, 7,000, so twice the size of many of them. But you're right, Luke, the crowds are
There were some flowers
packing
thrown then against the rules.
the pavements, yeah.
Again, let's just pause as the coffin is driven through Banchory. Well, again, as we saw in Ballater, very, very quiet. People just pausing, watching as the convoy drove through the town. I'm told there was some applause in some areas that I think our cameras perhaps didn't pick up. But again, as we saw in Ballater, just that sense of stillness. The crowd swiftly dispersing, but a sense of quiet and respect as the coffin was driven through.
Indeed. There was a ripple of applause. We did see a tear or two shed. There's Deeside in all of its glory and its majesty. It really is just the most fantastic part of the world. I wonder if I dare, at this point, generalise unwisely about the people of Scotland just in terms of how they handle situations like this, but I think it might be fair to say that they don't necessarily emote quite as enthusiastically as people down south, which is something we're quite proud of, actually, either in sorrow or in joy. And that was evident last year at the Platinum Jubilee celebrations. Something like 10,000 street parties held in England, I think just over 100 held in Scotland. Fewer than 200 applications. And, you know, anybody who took that as a sign that Scotland is some kind of, you know, seditious Republican hotbed is wrong, because you can see that today. There is no lack of warmth for the monarchy, but we don't necessarily feel like we have to demonstrate our emotions quite as wildly sometimes at times, a bit more reserved, and that's not a criticism at all. That's, if I dare to generalise, I'll be...
And if I dare to intervene, I did see tears wiped there,
yeah.
and I did see that modern phenomenon, the iPhone. Many people were recording this part of history for themselves in the modern way.
Yes, people want a record of it that's their own, not lifted from a television screen or a tablet.
And there's
but still quiet, still
quiet. And there is, you know, as we've been talking already, this mixture of emotions of respect.
Yes. It is a moment in history, as we have reflected so many times in the last few days. There are so many people who have only ever known one monarch. And this is perhaps, again, what we were saying earlier about the reality of today. This is the ultimate reminder, the ultimate visual reminder of the fact that we are into a new era. We have King Charles, and that a remarkable 70-year reign is over.
One speculates, I mean, but all those people have come to say goodbye, in a personal sense, and in historical sense, to the end of an era. Obviously, we can talk later about what the Second Elizabethan age has meant. She was, of course, the first Elizabeth for Scotland, it was only after the reign of Elizabeth I that the two kingdoms became joined in 1603. That was when we had the first accession council of the Privy Council to mark this new significance and this enrichment of English life becoming Anglo-Scottish.
There were many in Scotland who were angered by the title Queen Elizabeth II, because, as you say, Robert, she was not Queen Elizabeth II of Scotland, because Queen Elizabeth I was only Queen of England.
Yes,
and I think there were stories of post boxes being blown up at the time. That
Queen
had
Elizabeth I also, sorry, here's my A-level history coming out, Queen Elizabeth I cut off the head of Mary Queen of Scots.
She did.
So there was a lot of reconciliation to go on then in 1603.
And this queen, of course, as you will know far better than me, had a direct bloodline to Mary Queen of Scots, but not to the Queen Elizabeth.
Indeed, yes. Yes, it...
As you were saying, Robert, this is a final chance, isn't it, to say goodbye. And I suspect people here, this is not an occasion where people have come out to see the event. They've come out to pay respects.
Yes, and there's this, sorry, it's so difficult to avoid the cliches, but this mingling of the personal and the grand and the institutional that she did so very well. I mean, she basically did the job. As we're also going to be discussing, King Charles III, who will be King Charles III of Scotland and England, will be doing it in a new way, as we've already seen with the two walkabouts that have happened already. And so we're saying goodbye to a different royal style as well, but one who has certainly seen the monarchy through some very difficult times. If you had predicted back in the early 1950s, that not just that the Queen would live long, but the monarchy would actually thrive and become such an important part of popular culture, and more than that, the way people debate the monarchy, but every year Parliament votes £80 million to pay for it.
Yes.
And, you know, people who don't like it can go to their MPs and tell them to stop the money. But at the moment, that's almost voted through unanimously.
And that takes us to some of the themes that were discussed a lot around the time of the Platinum Jubilee. There may be people who would like the monarchy to reform in some way, who might like to see a slimmed down monarchy, and that might be something we will talk about this afternoon, Robert, even with some of the hints we've already had from the new king. But over the time of the Jubilee, I lost track of the number of people I interviewed who, even if they had issues, wanted a slimmed down monarchy, they said, I am here today on the Mall, at the palace, wherever it might have been, because of the Queen, because of that longevity, because of the years and years of duty and service that she has given to this country. There was a sense, another reason today is so poignant, there was a sense in which the Queen almost transcended, for a lot of people, all your other views about the monarchy as an institution. People still recognise that this individual had given 70 years of her life. She hadn't had a choice about how to live her life, what to do with her days. That is why she loved Balmoral. It was perhaps the few days where she could do what she wanted to do. But broadly, she hadn't had a choice, and she was working right up until the end.
And isn't it interesting how on the international scene, it was Vladimir Putin who couldn't rush, of all people, who couldn't rush fast enough to pay his respects, jumping on the bandwagon. This anti-monarchist, atheistic republic, let's not go near the war in Ukraine. But he too recognized what this woman meant and stood for.
Yes, he issued a statement very quickly, didn't he? Yes.
That separation of the individual and the institution is quite interesting as well when it comes to Scottish public opinion about the monarchy, I think, because by and large, I mean, it depends which poll you look at, who's been doing the polling, what question they've asked, who they've asked it to. But by and large, if you look across the polling in general, there's perhaps 10% less support for the monarchy in Scotland than there is south of the border. Not vast, but significant nonetheless.
Yes.
But there was such warmth for the Queen, because she was so obviously and undeniably fond of Scotland, and the Scots reciprocated that warmth. So you could, it will be interesting now to see then, with her, with the monarchy without her, how that sentiment manifests itself now, what happens. It's very difficult to tell what will happen with, public opinion of King Charles, because anything we could have predicted may well change in terms of public sympathy given the events. You don't know how you're going to feel. Nobody knew how they were going to feel now. We're all experiencing something perhaps that we didn't expect.
Absolutely, yes. Yes.
And how he conducts the next few days, weeks, what he says, where he says it, how he says it, will all have an impact.
Yes. I mean, striking that Professor Sir Tom Devine felt very strongly, didn't he, that the monarchy's love for Scotland and the way in which it values Scotland will sustain. I mean, he was in no doubt about that. But you are referring to the relationship the other way.
Well, who knows? I'm simply saying it's difficult to tell.
Indeed,
it's difficult to predict.
Indeed.
Tom Devine he's written a piece in one of the Sunday papers in Scotland this morning, saying that the monarchy is under no threat up there. King Charles will carry on his mother's work, and there'll be no change. You don't have to look far up there to find somebody who'll have a different opinion. Nobody knows. I have the answer on the Scottish Standard, by the way, if it's of interest.
No, do tell us.
Yeah, if you think of the lion rampant, the yellow and red Scottish flag that you sometimes see flown at football matches and so on, the flag of Scotland, the heraldic flag of Scotland, and then the three lions, the heraldic flag of England. On the Royal Standard, two corners with the three lions, one corner lion rampant, other way around in Scotland.
As it should be, yes. We should remember too that what we're seeing is part of a procedure that obviously carefully planned, although it happened much rather quicker than people expected. But it was the Queen herself who supervised and signed off on every detail. So it was the Queen herself who wanted her body, before it came down to England, to travel through the Scotland she loved, and as we're going to see later, be received in Edinburgh, the capital of Scotland, and stay there before it comes down to London.
Very, very much her wishes. As we saw with the Duke of Edinburgh, we know the extent to which he planned so much of his funeral, and so you're saying similarly,
yes,
in terms of everything we will see, not just today, but in the many days ahead.
Yes, and he for many years wasn't Prince Consort, but he was Duke of Edinburgh, and that's a significant choice as a title for the Queen's husband.
And so as we stay with these pictures, as the convoy makes its way, the Queen's coffin driven through some beautiful landscape. There is a long way to go, of course. The ultimate destination for today, as Robert Lacey suggests there, is Edinburgh. We know many, many preparations have been underway for some days in Edinburgh. They are expecting large crowds there. But that is yet to come. Possibly around 4 o'clock this afternoon, perhaps, is when we think this journey will close for today, and then more commemorations to come. There are church services happening across the country today, but we here, of course, on BBC News will stay with you to follow this journey. We will bring you, of course, continuing coverage throughout the day here on BBC News. In the next few moments, we say goodbye for a period to viewers on BBC One, but there will be much more coverage of this on BBC One a little later on this afternoon. We will keep you